So get this, you head to the fantasy section at the bookstore, right? You're expecting like epic battles and dragons and all that.
Hmm.
But instead, you're hit with a ton of romance. That's basically the fantasy world today with this whole romantasy thing blowing up. You guys sent in some really interesting stuff about this. So we're going deep on romance. What is it? Why is it suddenly everywhere? And what does it mean for like the future of fantasy? We're going to look at some wild sales figures and even get into some of the arguments about this whole trend.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how this mix of romance and fantasy is grabbing readers and really shaking things up.
So let's break it down. So anyone who's not familiar, what exactly is romantasy?
So basically, imagine fantasy world, but love stories are front and center. It's not just a little romance here and there. It's like woven into the whole plot. It drives how the characters grow and even shapes the entire story. And a lot of times these stories go into some pretty mature themes, exploring complicated relationships with all the magic and adventure as the backdrop.
Interesting. And looking at the stuff you sent, it seems like there's debate about whether romantasy is even like real fantasy.
Right.
Some people are even calling it chick lit, which I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of where things get interesting. You see this tension between like what people think of as traditional fantasy, the stuff that's often focused on battles and quests and things that are usually associated with male characters, versus this huge wave of romance-driven stories that are really popular with women. So it makes you wonder who gets to decide what a genre is, and is there space in fantasy for all these different voices and themes?
Yeah, for sure. And talking about grabbing readers, some of the stuff highlights authors like Rebecca Yarros and Sarah J. Maas. They're like dominating the fantasy charts, especially on Amazon. The numbers are crazy.
Oh, they are. Yarros alone, just this year, has supposedly made over $600,000 in sales, and it's not even the middle of 2025. It shows how much things are changing. Authors like Yarros, Maas, Kelly Hart, and Sarah A. Parker are killing it with romantasy, which means there's a huge demand for these stories.
Wow, that's insane. And one of the articles, I think it was from Bookseller magazine, said that most of the top 10 best-selling fantasy books in 2024 were by Maas and Yarros. Seems like romantasy is a big reason why the whole fantasy market is growing.
Definitely. While the entire fantasy market is expanding, the data shows that romantasy is a major factor in that growth. But it also brings up some interesting questions. Several sources point to a possible drop in male readers in the fantasy genre. Could this be because of romantasy? Like, are male readers feeling left out? Or are they just not finding the stories they're looking for?
It's something to think about for sure. One idea from the sources is that, the young adult fantasy audience, which was mainly female, has now grown up and moved on to romantic. Those readers who loved those magical worlds and creatures are now looking for stories with more adult themes, maybe more complicated relationships, something that romantasy seems to do.
That's a strong argument, and it reflects how genres change over time. They have to adapt to different readers and what they want.
But then what about the male read? How can publishers get them back? Or is that even possible? Can you cater to both groups without, I don't know, alienating one or the other?
That's a huge question for the industry. Some say focus on getting male readers back to traditional fantasy, but others say look at the subgenres where male authors are already doing well. For example, lit RPG, it's like D&D in book form, is really popular with male readers. Authors like Matt Dinneman with his Dungeon Crawler Carl books are a perfect example.
So maybe it's about focusing on how diverse fantasy, recognizing all those different subgenres and styles that appeal to different people.
Exactly, but the discussion goes further. The sources talk about some pretty strong opinions on this divide between romantasy and what some see as traditional fantasy. Some say romantasy is like weakening the genre, while others love its new perspective and how it's bringing in more readers.
It's like a clash of worldviews in the fantasy. But here's the thing. While romantasy is booming, authors like Brandon Sanderson, who writes more traditional epic fantasy, are also doing amazingly well. He even made it to the top 50 of all fiction authors for the first time last year.
Exactly. Sanderson shows that people still love both types of fantasy. Readers are drawn to the big epic stories and the more personal character-driven ones. It's not like one or the other.
So maybe it's not about competition, but about recognizing that fantasy has many sides and celebrating all the different stories it offers.
You got it. But there's more to it. The sources mention a controversy around Sanderson and his views on LGBTQ plus representation, which upset some readers. This brings up a big point. Social and political issues are often part of these genre discussions, which makes things even more complex.
Yeah, it adds another layer to think about. So we've got romantasy booming, maybe a decline in male readership, niche subgenres like LRPG finding their audience, and then these bigger questions about social and political representation genre. It's a lot to unpack.
It definitely is. It seems like the fantasy genre is at a crossroad, changing and growing in ways that are challenging the old rules and sparking important conversations.
It's almost like a battle for the heart of fantasy.
Maybe not a battle, but definitely a passionate debate about what makes something fantasy, who it's for, and where it's going.
And as readers, we're right in the middle of it all, trying to find our way and the stories.
That's what it comes down to. So what about you, listener? What are your thoughts on all of this? What kind of fantasy are you drawn to?
You know, it's kind of wild how romantasy is making everyone question, like, what makes a genre and who gets to decide. It's really pushing those traditional boundaries of fantasy.
It is, and maybe that's why it's clicking so well with women readers. The sources point out how they're drawn to the strong female characters and those complicated relationships you often see in romantasy. It's like they're finding a depth there that maybe they felt was missing in more traditional fantasy stories.
That makes sense. You said earlier that some people see this as like watering down the genre. How do you square that with, how incredibly successful romantic?
I think it's key to remember that genres aren't frozen in time, right? They change and adapt. Got to keep up with what readers want, what some see as diluting the genre, others might call innovation. Expanding what fantasy can be.
Yeah. But if romantasy is pulling in readers who might never have picked up a traditional fantasy book, wouldn't that actually be good for the genre overall? Like, could it lead to a much bigger and more diverse group of readers in the long run?
It's definitely possible. It's like romantasy is a gateway, right? Bringing people into the world of fantasy who might never have even considered it before. And once they're in, who knows, they might find other subgenres and authors that they love.
That's a cool way to think about it. It's like romantasy is building these bridges, connecting different kinds of readers through that shared love of magic, adventure, and of course, the romance.
Exactly. And it's not just about getting more readers. Romantasy is also changing the game for typical romance story. By putting these love stories in fantasy worlds, authors can explore new themes, different types of characters. They're making stories that feel both familiar and totally new.
You mentioned that some male readers might feel kind of pushed aside by this whole focus on romance, but there are still tons of successful authors writing those classic epic fantasies, right? So is it really about feeling alienated, or is it more about personal taste and finding the stories that you click with?
I think it's a bit of both, honestly. Some guys might feel like their kind of fantasy is getting lost in the shuffle, but others might just be looking for different subgenres that fit their taste better. That's where the variety within fantasy is so crucial. There's room for everyone and every kind of story.
You brought up Lit RPG as an example that's doing well with male readers. Could you break that down a bit for listeners who might not know what that is?
Sure. LRPG, it stands for Literary Role-Playing Game, basically blends fantasy with gaming. Imagine a book that feels like you're playing D&D, with all the stats, skills, and leveling up. It often has these virtual reality worlds or game-like settings where the characters have to beat challenges and go on quests.
So it's kind of like experiencing a video game, but through reading.
Exactly. And that's a big part of why people like it. You get that same excitement and engagement from gaming, but in a novel. And like we talked about, authors like Matt Dinniman with his Dungeon Crawler Carl book are doing amazingly well in this subgenre.
It sounds like there's a huge opportunity for authors and publishers to really explore these niche subgenres, catering to those specific interests and maybe even expanding the whole reach of fantasy.
I agree. By embracing that diversity within fantasy, instead of seeing it as a problem, the genre can keep growing and changing, offering something for everyone.
We've talked a lot about the numbers, the trends, all the different opinions on romance, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to, right, what connects with them, what they enjoy.
Absolutely. The magic of fantasy is how it can transport us to other worlds, spark our imaginations, make us feel that sense of wonder. Whether you love epic battles, sweeping romances, or crazy magic systems, there's a story out there for you.
And that's what makes this whole deep dive so cool. It's not just about analyzing a trend, it's about celebrating the power of story and how limitless the human imagination can be.
Well said. As we navigate this ever-changing world of fantasy, it's important to remember that there's no one right way to enjoy the genre. Embrace the stories that speak to you, explore those new worlds, and let yourself get swept away by the magic of fantasy.
It's kind of crazy how romantasy is like reflecting some of the bigger changes happening in the world right now.
Yeah, for sure. The themes and even the characters in these stories, they often line up with like how ideas about gender roles are changing, and relationships and what women want to see in their entertainment.
It's like romantasy is giving a platform to those who maybe haven't felt seen or heard in those more traditional fantasies.
Exactly. And it challenges those old ideas of what a strong female character is. In romantasy, strength can be about being emotionally open, dealing with tough relationships, or even just like owning your desire and making your own choices.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's not always about fighting with a sword or ruling a kingdom, right? It's about that inner strength, that resilience.
Right. And that really speaks to a lot of readers, especially women who are looking for characters they can connect with. Stories that kind of mirror their own experiences, their own hope.
So it seems like a genre changing isn't just about chasing trends or trying to sell more books. It's about showing the world as it is, always changing, and making room for new voices, new ways of looking at it.
Totally. Genres change because people change. And as we understand ourselves and the world better, the stories we tell change too, right? Even the way we tell them.
We've talked about a ton in this deep dive, those crazy sales numbers, the whole debate about what real fantasy even is, how it's affecting both fantasy and romance. But in the end, what really matters is what you, the listener, connect with.
Yeah, what kind of stories do you find yourself drawn to? What parts of fantasy really get your imagination going, make you want to keep reading?
Is it the epic battles and the adventure, or those intricate magic systems, all the fantastical creatures? Maybe it's the characters, how complex they are, the relationships they have.
Or maybe it's a mix of all that stuff.
That's the cool thing about fantasy. There's something for everyone. Whether you're into those classic epics or you love the romantic side of romantasy, there's a whole world out there to discover.
And as we wrap up, we want to encourage you to go beyond what you already know, right? Explore new authors, different subgenres. Let yourself be surprised by all the amazing stories fantasy has to offer.
Don't be afraid to try something new. You might discover new worlds, new voices, stuff that'll challenge how you think and open your mind.
That's where the real magic is, right? Finding those stories that really resonate with you, make you feel something. Stories that entertain you, inspire you, maybe even change you a little.
So go out there, you intrepid deep divers. Explore the endless world of fantasy. Happy reading.
And until next time, keep those imaginations running wild.